You don't have to settle for a job that makes you unhappy, and you don't have to go through the pain of searching through millions of job listings. Hired.com brings job offers to you, the engineer. Hired is a job marketplace built for the engineers. A few years ago, I was unhappy with my engineering job. I felt stuck, I felt underpaid, I felt alone, and I didn't know my value in the job marketplace. It's a very opaque market. So I used Hired.com to find a new position. Hired connected me with a talent advocate who guided me through the process, like a free concierge. They made me feel valued. It was like a white glove service. And this talent advocate helped me with all the questions I had. Should I ask for more money? Should I consider relocating to try to get a higher salary or a better job? The talent advocate that you get paired with on Hired.com helps you with all these kinds of questions. I got several job offers, and I found one that was a good fit. In fact, engineers who use Hired.com get an average of 5 offers from great companies like Facebook, Uber, and Stripe, and the companies are bidding on you to try to get the best engineers, and so you end up with the higher salary. Go to hired.com/sedaily for a $4,000 bonus upon signing up. It is completely free to engineers looking for a job. I've interviewed the founder of Hired, Matt Mitchkovich. He also started 99 Designs and SitePoint. He's a software engineer, and he understands that engineers deserve the leverage in this super competitive market where great engineers are at a premium. Check out hired.com/sedaily. I'm happy to advocate Hired to my listeners because it puts power in the hands of engineers. Now let's get on with this show. Michael Hartl is the creator of the Ruby on Rails tutorial, a widely acclaimed guide for developers learning how to create Rails web applications. Michael, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
You studied physics in university, even getting a PhD studying black hole dynamics at Caltech. How did you transition to software engineering, and what motivated your decision to switch careers?
That's a good question. I've been programming for a long time. I started when I was, 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there. I'm not even sure exactly. So software has always been something I've been interested in. I've always been interested in technology and programming and so on. And there's actually a lot of that in science too. These days, if you do any sort of research in astrophysics or like a lot of physics and astronomy involve a lot of computational work. So I was actually doing a lot of software right from the start when I started doing research when I was an undergrad at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics working in solar physics. That was mainly working in a language called IDL, Interactive Data Language, kind of like MATLAB. It's an array-based language. It's good for image processing. Tons of software development for that. My PhD research was in black hole in spiral dynamics, and that involved writing numerical integrators, visualizing the results of the integration runs. So there's tons of software development there too. So it's actually not that big a transition in the sense that you're doing software development all the time anyway. But what happened is when I was in grad school, I started to think that I would be more interested in taking an entrepreneurial route after I was done, rather than going into academia. And so while I was in grad school, I learned web development on the grounds that was a really useful skill for an entrepreneur. And I didn't realize at the time that my first successful company would be one that would teach people how to make web applications, sort of selling the pickaxes to the miners, so to speak. But so it really was motivated by an interest in entrepreneurship and a desire to have more control over the direction that I would be able to go in my career. Because academia is a great option for some people, but it's really quite confining in the sense that I was, like a lot of people in grad school, I was tired of my research by the time I was done. And I could have gone, I would likely have gotten a good postdoc. My advisor told me that I should apply to this a named postdoc at MIT, and that I would probably get it if I applied. So a lot of people assume it's weird. People inside academia, they think there's nothing better than being an academic. So if you left, it must be because you're no good. But really, my advisor, who is has notoriously high standards. Actually, the first time I really realized that he thought I was any good was when he said, "Yeah, you should apply to this postdoc at MIT that you can't even apply to unless you get recommended by a full faculty member, and you'll probably get it." I'm like, "Oh, really? Wow, that's awesome." I wouldn't necessarily have guessed that, but I would have ended up going to MIT maybe for a postdoc and doing the same research I was tired of at that point. Yeah, so you have to take a job wherever you get it. Because it's so, unless you're like one of the few best in the world at what you do, I mean, really like, Fields level, Nobel Prize level research, you have to take the job that you get. And I wanted to be more in control of my fate than that.
Yeah, I have an older brother who is in academia right now, and he's doing some postdoc work. And he's also a programmer, but he's more heavily involved in biology stuff. But we have this back and forth all the time about, I'm like trying to tell him, all the things that you don't like about academia would be solved if you left and did something on your own.
Yeah.
But perhaps, I don't know, perhaps there are certain things that you simply can't pursue. I mean, he always comes back to this idea of basic science research that you can't do, perhaps in the field of entrepreneurship. Do you think that's true? Is there this mutual exclusivity between basic science and doing a business?
I certainly think they're not necessarily aligned. Like as a business, you generally need to find a market that you can address right away. But if you look at some of the things that are coming out of Silicon Valley now, like Y Combinator, for example, is getting active in longer term research. They've just recently announced an initiative around AI, artificial intelligence, and Elon Musk is involved in that. So it's I think that there absolutely is a way that those two things can eventually come together. Whether you can make money in the short term on it, well, probably not. But once you've built up a network of really smart people, a lot of whom have made a lot of money, well, now you can do some really cool stuff in the long term. So I actually do think that you can do both. And I also think academics have an incentive to overestimate the importance of their own research. If you look at the incentive structure of academia, sometimes it's described as publish or perish. You have to publish or else your career will die. And so as a result of that, I think there's a lot of stuff that it doesn't really have to be done. And I mean, I think I could have done some interesting physics research, but I don't flatter myself to think that humanity had such a great loss that I didn't do more work on binary black hole and spiral. Really the groundbreaking work is done by a relatively small number of people. You do need a lot of people to do it's kind of a power law distribution, I think. So it's, if a potential Feynman, say, were to opt out, then that might be a loss. But it's pretty hard to be operating at that level. But truthfully, even the very best people, it gets pretty esoteric pretty fast, where you think, all right, well, how many people in the world really are going to read your papers? Like, my papers were pretty well received in grad school, but maybe a couple dozen people tops really read them for comprehension, and actually cared about them. Whereas more people have read the Rails tutorials since we started this podcast, right?
Right.
So I feel like there's, if you're interested in actually having an impact, certainly scientific research is one way of doing that, but I feel like becoming an entrepreneur is a much likelier way to help people. And certainly my own my own experience has been very gratifying, that a lot of people have been able to benefit from the stuff that I've done.
So many of the people that I've interviewed who have moved from academia to programming, they often go down the road of data science, and we see fewer people who have moved to the area of full stack web application development. Did you consider a more quantitative route?
I did. I looked at finance as one of the things that a lot of people with PhDs in physics or mathematics end up going to Wall Street. And I certainly could have made a lot more money if I'd gone that route. But I like making things, and I find it very gratifying to make new things. And I like actually helping individual people. So it's true that I have this background in science, and it's still definitely a big part of what influences my worldview. But when I was in grad school, I was also an instructor. They say a teaching assistant, but I was the primary instructor. The way Caltech works is there's a lecture professor, but the people who actually teach you how to solve problems are the TAs. And so I had a pretty sizable number of people twice a week for 2 hours of what they call recitation section a week, and I was good at it. I was very successful as a classroom instructor. So what I'm doing right now, actually, and what I eventually realized was the right thing for me to do as an entrepreneur, was to turn my teaching skill set into products. So that's actually what I'm doing now. I have a knack for explaining hard subjects or counterintuitive subjects in a way that is accessible and not just that is clear, but that connects with people emotionally as well. That I'm one of the things I do. I've given a talk about this where if you can embed your technical narrative in some sort of story arc, and you can use this idea that humans are really good at understanding things through story. If you can motivate every step of the way, so people really feel like they're being carried along by this narrative, it's a lot easier to learn that way. So actually, even though I could have gone into something that used my quantitative experience, I am in the sense I've done a lot of software development for my own companies, but a lot of the subjects are very technical. The actual skill set that I'm using is the teaching and explaining skill set, which I find personally more gratifying. Like I said, even though I could have made a lot more money if I'd gone in and into work at a hedge fund or something in finance, I wouldn't have been using this skill set, and it wouldn't have been as much fun.
Sure. So the Ruby on Rails tutorial, this is an extremely popular tutorial. I've used it myself. I think most of the people I know who have learned Rails have used it. Let's talk some about Rails history. What was unique about the Ruby on Rails tutorial when it first came out? Like when you started working on this tutorial, why were there no other resources, or were there other resources for learning Rails?
There were lots of resources for picking up little pieces of Rails, and I think my approach when I started with the Rails tutorial was to look at it through the eyes of someone who taught physics for 5 years at Caltech, and I developed an intuition for how big a subject was. And in my view, most of the resources for learning Rails and for learning web development generally underestimated the difficulty of the subject. They would take the view that, this is just 20 page web tutorials or a couple hours of video. And I looked at the subject, I thought, no, it's much harder than this. I had written my own sort of half-baked web framework in Python in the 2004, 2005 or so. This is right around the time. I'd started that before Rails had even come out. So I knew how hard web development was, and I had a good intuition for the size of the subject. And I thought, no, this is more like a one term, like a quarter course, 10 to 20 hours of instruction, and that just didn't exist. There was no one out there who had addressed that market from that perspective at the time. So I felt like people almost saw. It's one of these things when you start to teach a subject and you try to make it as accessible as possible, you realize just how much there is that that you just assume. But no, once you make that explicit, it's like, wow, I make the Rails tutorial is as short as I can make it. It's over 700 pages.
Yeah. So, I remember the first time I used Rails, and up until that time, the only thing I had used to build web apps were Java frameworks. And yeah. I remember the first time I made a Rails app and I hit my server with the browser, I remember feeling such a surge of opportunity and a feeling of how simple it was to get something going. You've been around for a little longer than I have. Was there any other framework that had such simplicity, or was Rails really the first one?
Yeah, I think Rails was probably the first one that kind of put it all together. And again, because I'd written my own half-baked framework, I knew the problems that Rails was solving. I knew them really well. And when I first saw Rails, I thought, oh wow, it just puts it all together. It's all of those things that I hacked together on my own, and on my own project. Rails had actually codified and put it just had baked into the framework. And then that's because David Heinemeier Hansen developed it as part of a real project, as part of building the initial version of Basecamp, and then he extracted the framework from Basecamp. So it was always really practically oriented. But because I knew the problems that I had as a web developer, and I saw that Rails solved all those problems, I thought, well, I need to learn this. And I think if Django had come out just a little bit sooner, I might have gone that route because I already knew Python really well. I had to learn Ruby in order to use Rails. But my I would people sometimes ask, well, how long will it take to learn Ruby? Well, it depends on where you're coming from. All right, it depends on what you already know. So having already studied a bunch of different languages, including Python and Scheme, which is a dialect of Lisp, I felt like I could probably pick up Ruby pretty quickly, and it definitely took some work, but I was able to get up to speed pretty fast, and it really seemed like Rails just put everything together. So I thought, well, let's give this thing a try, and I liked it.
So Python, Ruby on Rails is more popular than Django for sure, even though Python is probably a more popular language than Ruby.
Yeah.
Why do you think that happened? Was that just an issue of timing, or was there actually something about the framework that did a really good job, or?
It's hard to say. I actually don't know. I've looked a little bit at Django, but I don't know it well by any means.
I don't either.
I think that there probably was a lot of timing. There is something though that's different about Ruby. So Python has huge adoption in science and data science. A lot of Python, and there are some really big Django sites out there too. But Ruby is a little bit more flexible than Python, and in particular because Ruby has anonymous blocks as part of a common pattern and a lot of support for making blocks. Ruby is better at Python at making domain-specific languages, or DSLs. So, for example, if you look at Flask, which is a micro framework for web applications in Python, and compare it to Sinatra, which is a Ruby micro framework, Sinatra is just so much more natural. It's just there's like a line that you can eliminate every single method. There's one fewer line in Sinatra because of Ruby blocks, and it feels like you're writing in a language that is designed for making web apps. So Ruby lets you do this in a way that very few languages do. So I think that's part of Rails' success, is that it uses the flexibility of Ruby to make a domain-specific language for writing web applications. And as a result, it just feels a lot more natural when you're writing it. You can write more compact code. It's easier to remember how to do things, or at least that's been my experience.
So thinking in a more modern context, we're kind of seeing the industry move from predominance of Rails applications to full stack JavaScript applications becoming more predominant. Do you think this shift is also happening at the early education level, or is a new developer still choosing to learn Ruby on Rails and eventually migrating to full stack JavaScript, or how do you see that shift occurring?
I've been paying some attention to this, but it's hard to know for sure. I'm among other things, I'm interested in at some point in getting involved in the JavaScript market. There's a problem with it though, which is that it seems like every 6 months the exact suite of technologies changes, right? So it's like there isn't a Ruby on Rails of the JavaScript world that has become the standard. And so from the perspective of the educational market, it's harder to know exactly how to address it. One of the things that I've thought about is that everyone needs to learn how to write web applications at some level, right? If you're going to write web apps in JavaScript, you're going to have to know what a web app is. That's a lot of work. So the Rails tutorial is actually, if you look at the subtitle, it's actually learn web development with Rails. It's not. It's actually not designed specifically as a tutorial to teach you Rails per se, although it is good for that, and a lot of people use it for that purpose. It's really designed as an introduction to web application development, which happens to use Ruby on Rails. So I would say that anyone who wants to learn to build JavaScript web apps would do well to go through the Ruby on Rails tutorial, learn what a web app is, and then they'll be in a better position to understand what problems the JavaScript frameworks are solving. I mean, I've had a lot of people tell me actually that there are Django shops, and they'll say we have people go through the Ruby on Rails tutorial and then teach them Django because they understand that web application development, no matter which technology you use, has to solve a common set of problems. So my hope is that eventually I will be able to offer some JavaScript products. But I feel like sending people through the Rails tutorial is still probably a good idea.
Yeah. I think you're actually right. I did an interview recently with a coding boot camp, and they taught Ruby on Rails. They teach Ruby on Rails, and I was a little critical because I was like, well, you have these brand new people who are coming into the boot camp, and you're teaching them Rails, and they don't know any better, but perhaps the job market is more demanding of full stack JavaScript at this point. But I think you make a good point in that perhaps it doesn't matter, because you don't want to teach a new bootcamp student, hey, here's Express, and then here's all the front end frameworks you can use, and there are no best practices. Go. You want to say, here's Rails. Here's how things are done. You can do other things, but here's how things are done.
Yeah, I think if you expand your scope a little bit, instead of thinking of learning full stack web app development with JavaScript, what you're doing is learning how to build web applications as a general problem. And I understand there's a temptation to just pick one language and go with it. I feel like that's really short-sighted, though. I don't know any good developers who only know one language.
Yeah,
right. Like
it's true.
And I also don't particularly like JavaScript. I feel like there are real advantages to using Ruby in when you can, which is on the server. So
sure. What are the trade-offs you see?
Well, it's hard to really to pin it down. I mean, I feel like Ruby is just so much more elegant. My subjective experience writing Ruby is much happier. But the truth is, I haven't done a whole lot of JavaScript recently. I did a bunch of JavaScript in the early 2000s, and so I do plan to look at this under. I mean, we can talk a little bit more about it too. So what I'm working on now is under a sort of a more general approach to teaching people tech skills, for more broadly defined.
Sure.
And JavaScript definitely fits in with that mission.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we'll get into that. We should talk a little bit more about Rails. So David Heinemeier Hansson, or DHH as he's commonly known, the creator of Ruby on Rails, he had a popular post back in 2012 called Rails is Omakase, where he talks about certain aspects of Rails that there's a vocal minority that they sometimes criticize about the framework. Is there anything about Rails that you're not a fan of that you would change?
That's a good question. I'm actually not the best person to ask for this, though, because I operate at an unusual part of the market. So I actually don't do a lot of Rails application development day to day. In fact, my current venture, which we can talk more about, I have a couple of strong co-founders who they actually do most of the web app development for my current company. From my perspective, what I'm interested in is how can I break down this subject so that it's as accessible as possible to people who are just starting out with Rails or with web development. So the kinds of things that people run into that they don't like about Rails, I don't run into at that level. So there's nothing that sort of springs to mind. I mean, I would say that it's they're just like minor things. Rails takes a while to start up, right? Right. But this is not a showstopper, and there are various ways to work around it. But there's nothing major. There's nothing about Rails where I think, what a mess. This needs to be fixed. There's just there's some friction in various places, but I feel like Rails has gotten to the point where it's mature enough that pretty much any web app problem you want to solve, it will help you solve.
Yeah. So let's talk about your newest company, which is Softcover. What are you building?
Yeah, actually, I can tell you more about that. So the Softcover itself is it's a publishing platform for technical authors. It's an ebook production tool chain and a sales and marketing platform. And when we started Softcover, there was always an open question: do we want to go after the sort of the self-publishing toolchain market, or do we want to mainly use this for making our own products? And so at this point, it's looking like the educational market is a better market to be in for a couple of reasons. It's kind of a hard sell to get people to switch toolchains if they're self-published authors. And when you're starting a company, you want, or when you're offering a product, you want what investors sometimes call a hair on fire problem, which is you want your potential customers to come to you and say, "My hair is on fire. Can you please put it out?" You want them not really particularly to care how much the solution costs, or you don't want them. You don't have to sell them on it particularly. You want them to know that they have a problem, and if you can solve that problem for them, then they're happy to give you their business. And so I absolutely see that in the educational market. When people are just starting out, it's so hard to learn these subjects, whether it's web app development or just programming generally, tech skills generally. People are just so grateful to find something that fits the way they learn. And
so the problem that you're attacking, is it the publishers, or is it the you're trying to make education better for the students who are purchasing these educational products?
The latter. I'm trying to make things better for people who are learning these subjects, and so to that end, we've started. It's all powered by Softcover. We started a new website called under the brand Learn Enough to Be Dangerous at learnenough.com. And what I'm working on now is mainly a series of prerequisite tutorials for the Rails tutorial. A lot of people have come to me and said, "Hey, is the Rails tutorial good for complete beginners?" And the answer is not really. It's not designed for people who are starting from scratch. It does its the best it can, because a lot of people have used it that way anyway. And I'm really impressed actually at when people get through it with no background. It takes a lot of determination, and often people will tell me they just go through it twice. They do it once. Just go back to the beginning and do it again. Do it a second time. But what I realized though is that that's in what they call in the entrepreneur business a proxy for demand. When people are saying, they're asking you, is there something? Is this product good for complete beginners?
Here's my terrible hack for solving this.
What they're really saying is, if you had a product for complete beginners, I would like to use it. And another thing that I've discovered, which kind of really to my surprise, is that a lot of non-web developers have used the Rails tutorial. So last year I went to a conference that Amy Hoy runs called Bacon BizConf. You're bringing home the bacon, and it's aimed at software as a service, like bootstrapped companies. And the idea that you're bringing home the bacon, it means that you're charging right away, that you're trying to build a sustainable business right from the beginning. You're not a VC funded startup that's going to try to get huge or die, but instead you're trying to build something that's which, let me say, I have no problem with those kinds of companies. I know a lot of people, they like to rant against them, but a lot of companies, that's the only way they can succeed, is to raise a bunch of money and do all or nothing. But there are a lot of businesses that don't need to do that nevertheless follow that model just because that's what everyone else is doing. So anyway, I went to this conference that was full of business people, bootstrap, sort of technical-ish, but not developers per se. And it was a small conference, maybe 50 people. Probably a third of the people came up to me at one point or another during the conference and said, "Hey, I just want to let you know I really like the Rails tutorial." And I said, "Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Why did you read the Rails tutorial? I don't understand. You're not a web developer." And they said, "Well, I wanted to know what the tech people were doing. I wanted to understand what web apps were and just have a basic understanding of the technology behind what we were doing." And so the Learn Enough to Be Dangerous tutorials are aimed at the complete newbies, people who are really starting from scratch, and also at people who want to have technical skills generally, but don't necessarily want to become web developers themselves. So that's my current, like what I'm personally working on is this series of prerequisites, and a couple of them have launched. The written.
This is a giant market, by the way. I know from all the different interviews I've done lately with coding boot camps and coding education stuff. There are so many people who are migrating to programming as the savior of, what the hell do I do? I'm unemployable right now.
Right.
How do I learn to code? So what are the prerequisites? What do people need to know?
Yeah, it's interesting. Part of it, it's as an educator, this is such a fun challenge. Like, how do I break down this subject, and what's the order? And if you look at things that are aimed at beginners, if you look at like web development tutorials, they'll have like a section on, here's the command line, and you open up the bash RC file with your text editor, and the section, it will literally just cover like 5 commands. And I was looking at this and thinking, people don't know what a text editor, they've never even heard of what a text editor is. If you say, well, use the command line, they don't know what a command line is. They've never even heard of the idea of this thing. And so I thought, initially, I thought, well, I can start by teaching people a text editor. And then I thought, no, the way I personally launch a text editor is always at the command line. And so I thought, actually, the first thing to teach is the command line. But that introduces an interesting bootstrapping problem, because how do you teach the command line without a text editor? Because you need to have files that people are editing. You need to have content that they're like using to, they're going to move it, or they're going to use less to look at the contents. And the way I solved that was to use echo and redirect. So the learn enough command line to be dangerous, which is linked from learnenough.com, starts with echo hello world. That's the hello world of the command line terminal. And then you learn how to redirect that to a file, and then you can manipulate that file. And so one of the principles I use when I'm designing tutorials is I defer things as far as I can. And I realized when doing this tutorial, I could defer directories until the last section. Most of these tutorials, they start you with directories right away. But I realized, no, we're going to spend quite a bit of time learning how to deal with files, and then only later will we bother with directories. And so that it gives you a more natural progression, I think. So the small files are echo with redirect, and then you need a bigger file though if you're going to learn how to use less, or to grep it, or that sort of thing, or to use a word like word count to figure out how big it is. And so to that end, I introduced curl. So it's like this is how to download a web page, download a file at the command line using curl, and so that's the first tutorial is the command line. It's a command line tutorial that designed for people who don't even necessarily know what a command line is. The second tutorial is a text editor. And it starts off with the absolute, what I call minimum viable Vim, the absolute least amount of Vim you can get by with. And I basically warn people that Vim is hard. I don't recommend it as a text editor for a complete beginner, but it is a full-strength text editor, and you could use this as your main text editor. But as quickly as possible, I transitioned to more familiar text editors, and I specifically target Sublime Text and Atom. Most of the tutorial uses Atom because Atom is free in both beer and speech senses of the term,
and better than Sublime.
Quite possibly. I think there are pros and cons, but the bottom line is that the Learn Enough text editor to be dangerous, who again links at learnenough.com, is aimed at the generic skills of a proficient text editor, or a proficient user of a text editor. So there's massive overlap. Like the diffs between Sublime Text and Atom at the level of this tutorial are negligible.
Sure. Okay. So what is the end result of somebody who goes through the Learn Enough program? How much have I learned to code by the end of it?
So the current sequence is planned up to an introduction to Rails, Learn Enough Rails to be dangerous, and so you'd be very well prepared for the Rails tutorial. And in fact, so even one of the other things that's interesting, like what's the third thing in the sequence, and it's not obvious, but the third, I've started it. I'm going to be working on it this week. The third tutorial in the sequence is Learn Enough Git to be dangerous. even before anything else. And it's crazy. You think that's nuts to start to do Git before even HTML or CSS. But we're going to be doing some really cool stuff with it. So my co-founder, Lee Donahoe, he's a designer. He's been working on the HTML tutorial and the CSS tutorial as well. And because we can assume Git and text editor and command line is a prerequisite, people are going to be launching full production websites to GitHub pages in their, and in fact, even in the Git tutorial. I'm gonna sneak it in. So basically, people will be able to get through this sequence. But at any point, like, it is useful at every stage, even if they don't want to eventually learn the Rails tutorial. Just being able to do, like, think of how awesome it is as a developer to work with someone like a project manager or a designer who can fire up a terminal, do a Git pull, open a text editor, make a change, make a commit, do a Git push, right? That makes your life so much better.
Absolutely. I love being a software engineer because of how easy it is to build side projects. And I've built countless side projects. I've built a social gambling application, a dating website backend that had 0 users, a stock trading music rhythm application for Android. And I think every developer should have side projects. So when I have a web app that I want to deploy and share, I want to show my friends my most recent project that nobody will care about, I use DigitalOcean to quickly spin up a server and host my projects. And who knows, if one day one of my apps takes off and goes viral and people actually do care, I can easily scale using DigitalOcean's flexible pricing plan. Companies like TaskRabbit that have grown rapidly have used DigitalOcean for this very reason. But until this happens, I will happily stick with the $5 a month plan. Sign up with promo code SEDaily to get a free $10 credit as a listener of our show and start building your apps. We would love to see what listeners build, so send us an email showing us your project. I've also interviewed Moisey Uretsky, who is the co-founder of DigitalOcean, and he mentioned that the ease of use and the flexibility is why they built the service in the first place. That DigitalOcean interview is one of my favorite episodes. Moisey talks about bleeding in a data center. He says, you don't know how hard it is to do a cloud hosting service until you've bled in a data center. It's really interesting. So speaking of which, let's get on with this episode of Software Engineering Daily. So, okay, but here's one thing I'm curious about, because a lot of the people that learn to code, like I remember when I was learning to code, the things that would really keep me going were those little nuggets of seeing something compile, seeing something display on a web page, almost the gamification aspect of it, where you get that little dopamine response. Right. And I'm sure as an educator, you understand this. Right. How do you work that into an education process that is focused on Echo Hello World and learning Git?
Well, I think this is part of the reason I work in this field, is because I really enjoy solving that problem. How am I going to make this interesting? How am I going to make it? How am I going to give people that little rush of discovery that, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just did that. That's amazing. And so one of the things I do is I put in lots of exercises. I just force myself in every section to think, all right, how am I going to extend what we've just done? It's actually kind of fun. I'll be going along and thinking, this is a little bit too advanced. I don't want to cover this. I think, that's an exercise. It's a perfect thing for the exercises, something that built on the foundation and extends it a little bit. So I would say that absolutely is a problem, and that's I love solving that problem. I love it's an opportunity for creativity to come up with things that are interesting. So, for example, with with the command line tutorial, there's an exercise for, like, how are you going to echo something that has quotes in it? How do you do that? Well, you have to nest. But that's hard. And you think that's so trivial. Like, why does anyone even care? And the answer is because they tried a couple times and it doesn't work. And, right. And when you try something a couple times and it doesn't work, and then you get it to work, you're like, whoa, it almost doesn't even matter what the thing is. It's like, whoa, there's this.
So you get them frustrated first, and then you debug their frustration.
Because that's really that's your lot in life as a technical person. Is you're always running into these little annoyances, and it's just a matter of like, all right, I'm going to power through this. I'm going to figure out, maybe take a break, maybe come back and take a look at it. Maybe Google some things related to my problem. And this actually plays into something that has turned out to be a theme in the Learn Enough products, which is what I call technical sophistication. It's a soft skill. It's really hard to pin down exactly what it means, but it's a combination of knowledge and the ability to acquire new knowledge. So I'll have this. I'm actually having my mom go through the text editor or the command line tutorial so she has general.
That is the ultimate test.
Yeah, so she has general computer knowledge. Knows how to use applications, but she'd never used a terminal before this. And I did a screen hero session with her just to walk her through some things and see where she was getting stuck. And there was something I wanted to do. I wanted to echo with the \n. So to get the new line, I want to do so. There's a command line option for echo to suppress the new line, and then I wanted to put the new line in explicitly. But on my system and on her system, so on OS 10, there was it would just print out the \n literally. It wasn't putting in a new line. And so I said, well, let's solve this. And I Googled around for the solution to my problem, discovered that printf exists at the command line, which I didn't know. And I told my mom, I said, I did not know until this moment that you could use printf at the command line in OS 10. And yet we've discovered this. And then we discovered an undocumented option to echo that would let you print out that would turn the \n into a literal new line and would actually put it in. And we would achieve the result we wanted. It would, like, literally, you man echo, and it's not listed, but we found it like some Stack Overflow thread or whatever. And I said to my mom, "This is technical sophistication." I literally had no idea that these things were possible until this minute, but I have this sort of general skill to figure out. Like, I know the kinds of things to Google, and then you combine that with an attitude. It's like, oh, okay, computer, you think you're not going to print that new line? Well, let me tell you something. You are going to print that new line. I'm going to figure out how to get you to print that new line. Darn it.
Well, and so if you don't have that technical proficiency, if you don't have the right attitude, then the feeling you might get upon discovering that undocumented thing is like, I'm stupid, or, I am doing something wrong, rather than, oh, this is cool, this actually exists.
Yeah.
So the attitude adjustment is definitely important.
Right.
So I want to come back to something that you said when you were talking about the the Bacon conference? Bring home the Bacon conference?
Bacon BizConf, yeah.
Bacon BizConf, yeah. So, I mean, this podcast is typically about software engineering, and I try to restrain myself from going into matters of entrepreneurship, but you touched on it because I think there's a lot of entrepreneurship podcasts, but there's not a ton of software engineering podcasts. But regardless, I think a good number of my listeners are entrepreneurial, or whatever that means. And so, you touched on a lot of things that I found interesting. The first one was, this lifestyle business versus venture scalable business. I find this conversation really interesting. And I think it's particularly interesting for somebody like you, because you went through Y Combinator, which is almost like the meat grinder of learning about how venture capital works, how investment works, how billion-dollar venture scalable businesses work. So I'm just really curious to get your thoughts on how that experience affected you, what your current perspective is on this, maybe the Silicon Valley miasma of we need to be venture-backed versus we can have a lifestyle business. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have thought a lot about this, and there are some people who we've even mentioned during this podcast who've kind of gotten a lot of attention bashing the VC model, and I understand what they're doing. Like they've got an angle, they've got a brand, and they're just going to. They're using that angle to get attention. But I feel like there's really a false dichotomy being set up here between the lifestyle business and the venture-backed business, because what you're really doing is you're making a company that potentially can scale up to lots of to many users. That's what distinguishes a startup from another kind of business is that it can grow in sort of non-linearly, in the sense that you can add maybe 100 or 1,000 times more users without having to hire 100 or 1,000 times more people. And so a lot of these software businesses that are sometimes kind of denigrated a little bit with the term lifestyle business, this is the way VCs say, or it's kind of they put you down. So the way these lifestyle businesses work, a lot of them are software businesses that could, in fact, become venture-backed startups at some point. So I think that the criticism that's valid is this idea that you have to take the venture capital route. But so sometimes people will say, well, I would never take money for my company. And I think that fundamentally misunderstands the nature of investment. Basically, if you can bootstrap, you should. And in fact, everyone will tell you this. I've talked with the people in the founder of Techstars about this. I've talked with the Y Combinator partners and founders about this. Everyone agrees you should bootstrap if you can. You should take capital if you are at the point where taking capital is the right thing for your business. It sounds like a tautology, but if you're capital constrained in your business, if you see that you can take over a market, if you can win big by taking $1 million or $2 million or $10 million investment, then you should do that. You should understand the trade-offs, though. You should understand that once you take a large amount of money, you either have to get big or go home. So Codecademy, for example, is sort of in this learning to code space, and they've taken a huge amount of money. They've taken $10 million last time I checked. So they have to get big or go home. Whereas Code School was bootstrapped, and they Pluralsight bought them for, I think it was $35 million, which if you've raised $10 million and you sell for $35 million, like that's not actually that great a return for your investors. But if you're bootstrapped, it's a great return for the people who started it. So both models work. It's just a matter of what sort of market are you in? What do you want your company to achieve? And I think maybe one of the best examples of this that Joel Spolsky's written about it with respect to his company, his software company, Fog Creek Software, which makes fog bugs, among other things, contrasted with...
And Trello, right?
Yeah, and Trello. And contrasted with another company he started, which is Stack Exchange, the makers of Stack Overflow. And basically, Stack Overflow is in a land grab situation where either you're going to win or die. And so if you're in that situation, you have to take money, because if you don't, your competitors will, and they'll beat you. So if you look at the successful company, like most of the multi-billion-dollar companies simply could not have succeeded without venture capital at some point. So what I would generally advise people to do is bootstrap if you can. Focus on making a product that people want, and especially if you can find a way to charge for it. And if you get to the point where you're capital constrained, you're like, wow, if we could just hire another 10 or 20 people, we would be so much better off. Like we could really grow much, much faster. Then you should take money. But if you're in a business where you can keep bootstrapping indefinitely, then you should do that. And the Y Combinator people will tell you the same thing.
And so, to be clear, the people who I think you kind of subtly referred to as being vocal about this is David Hannemeyer Hansen, who he's talked a lot about this because his company Basecamp has not taken $1 of funding, and he's very proud of that. And he's, I think part of it, from his point of view, is that a lot of it comes down to what is the lifestyle that you want. And I guess, that does come back to the term lifestyle business, but as Basecamp is a non-venture funded business, he is opting into a very different lifestyle than whoever is in charge of Trello, making their own productivity software that they raised a bunch of money for. So in your personal experience, the Rails tutorial, for example, has become a lifestyle business.
Right.
And I think you even called it that. I'm trying to denigrate you. I think you called it on your website. You drew inspiration from the Tim Ferriss 4-hour work week. Yeah. And so I can talk from my personal perspective. This show, Software Engineering Daily, feels like a lifestyle business right now, but it also feels like it could potentially be scalable. Is it important to know whether your business is a lifestyle business or when it's a lifestyle business, or how do you how have you framed that in your personal experience?
Yeah, so I mean, the lifestyle business label is sort of tough to get away from. The way I thought of the Rails tutorial was that I wanted it to be a medium risk, medium reward business, and that's actually something we didn't talk about when we were talking about lifestyle businesses versus venture backed businesses. The Rails tutorials market is probably too small to justify a full venture backed startup. So it really, when you're talking about these different kinds of businesses, often it really is just like, what's the addressable market size? So I will say that many more people start startups than should, I think, and it's generally miserable starting a startup. If you can start with something that's a little bit narrower in scope and that's more focused on making a living right away, I think that's the way to go. I think many more people should be making product businesses as their first step to learn how to sell, to learn how to ship, and to get an income stream going. And then later on, maybe do something that's a little bit higher risk, higher reward. And I think that in some cases, though, you can grow, really to the point where you are at the scale of a venture-backed startup, because you're in such a cash-rich business. So Basecamp is an example of this. I was actually at startup school, and David gave his it's a really well received and a well delivered talk on this subject about venture-backed startups versus bootstrapping, and you can Google around for it. It's I think it was in 2008 maybe, and I think Basecamp is an unusual case though, because they're software as a service, and that is the sort of business that you might be able to grow organically, sort of indefinitely. But I will say that Basecamp makes a fortune, and if Basecamp wanted to go public, I think they probably could. It's such a cash-rich business, though, it doesn't really matter. And since they didn't take venture funding, they don't have to, because there's no one who needs to cash out, particularly. But Basecamp really is the kind of company that might have been defeated in the marketplace if there had been a venture-backed startup at the right time and place with good enough people. I just think the people who started Basecamp are so good, and then they're in such a cash-rich, or they're in a business where they can be charging right away, that they've been able to grow big in terms of their revenues, at least, without taking VC.
What was your experience like at Y Combinator? What did you apply with, and what lessons did you learn?
Truthfully, I'm a big supporter of Y Combinator, and I'm glad to have done it. But my actual experience was often painful, and truthfully, I don't like to talk about what I applied with, and it's really unpleasant. It was just like we switched ideas a couple times. We had to talk to investors way earlier than we really wanted to. It was really kind of a mess. And I think, in fact, if you look at the companies that go through Y Combinator now, most of them, an actual majority of them, have taken funding from someone else already, and they're the kinds of companies that I generally recommend go through Y Combinator. There are some cases where people just started from scratch and did well, but generally speaking, the more successful companies are ones where they've already got a product, they're already launched, and they've or maybe not, at the very least they've been developing it for a while before doing YC, and YC just takes them to the next level. But I'll say that. The idea, so I just want to go back briefly. We're talking about this idea of the venture-backed startup and that model. And I one of the things that I try to resist is this idea of being proud of not taking money. It depends on, should the Google founders be ashamed that they took money? Right? You couldn't build Google without investment. It was actually, they were built by angel investors. They took, I think, $75 million in angel funding before they even went to VCs, and they were able to drive a really hard bargain with their venture capitalists because they were in such a strong negotiating position, having already raised so much money and gotten so much traction. But Google, there were these big upfront costs. They had to buy bandwidth, basically, and they had to build out their infrastructure to index the web. They just couldn't do that by bootstrapping. There's no way that you could build Google by bootstrapping. Uber nowadays is exactly the kind of company you absolutely like. That is a land grab situation. The right thing for Uber to do is to expand as fast as possible. Like, given that if they win, they're basically addressing the market of like urban mass transit. It's like the market is unbelievably vast. and so the right thing for them to do is to keep expanding to new cities. And it's weird because they'll criticize companies for growing without any business model or without any real concrete plan to make money, as if they're idiots. But you have to remember, the people who are investing in these companies are the best in the world at what they do. They are not idiots. They're not investing in Twitter thinking, oh, well, maybe someday they'll they don't want Twitter to have a business model right away. Right? I mean, now they want them to have a business model because they've gotten so huge. But the point is that when you're growing so fast, that basically you have to choose between growing and making cash in the short term. And so the question is, these companies, what they're trying to do is to maximize their total value, right? The way you do that is by maximizing the revenues like over an infinite time horizon. So you would much rather make like $10 billion a year in 5 years than make, $100 million this year. If you have an option to do to make $100 million this year, but it's if you're trying to build as big a business as possible, which certainly you are if you're a venture-backed startup, then you're happy to defer that to the future, and in exchange for growing right now, especially when you're in a winner-take-all market where there are strong network effects. It's just you will lose. Someone will take over that market unless you grow. And so I feel like a lot of people overgeneralize from their own experiences, and it's such a weird criticism to say, well, this company is growing so fast without a business model. Like, if you have 1 billion customers, like, you built a valuable company, right? Maybe it's not going to be Google scale. And Google didn't know what they were doing exactly. They thought they could put banner ads up there, and then the tech bubble burst, and DoubleClick was ailing, and they actually had to figure out what they were going to do, and they ended up they adapted a model developed by a company called GoTo, later Overture, and in fact they eventually had to pay a large settlement. Like, there was a patent involved that Google violated. Yahoo by that time had bought Overture, and so they had to pay Yahoo like a significant settlement. But the point is that Google they were doing the right thing by growing, and they found their business. As it turned out, one of the world's best business models ever was just was undeveloped, and it was barely being claimed. Like, only GoTo was doing it. But so Google had this amazing business model that the people express an intention when they go to a search engine, and it turns out that selling text ads against those searches is unbelievably effective.
Although back then you had to pay for servers, so that's a pretty big difference.
That's true. So you're right. So I mean, servers and bandwidth were more expensive back then. But the point is that the only way to win that market is to grow fast. And so basically, when you take money, is you're saying the money is worth more. Like, we need to grow now, and we need money now to grow. Eventually, we'll make we'll be able to turn this into income. But the idea that somehow you're less of a business because you aren't making money right away, I think misunderstands the nature of business.
What I do like about the conversation is that most software businesses are not Uber, where you need to expand into a bazillion different markets with a bazillion different products all at once. They're not Zenefits, where you need to hire a bazillion salespeople. They're like Dropbox, right? Or you're like building a very specific product, and it's like, you really need to hire a bazillion engineers if you're Dropbox? I don't know. Probably not. Maybe.
Yeah.
If you don't need to pay for servers, what do you need capital for? So it's not that you should not raise capital. It's that this is absolutely worth questioning the dogmas of venture capital.
I completely agree. And I think actually David specifically talked about Dropbox as a company that could have bootstrapped. Although, honestly, it's hard to argue with Dropbox's results. Like, they've done very well. But I know where he's coming from. So that, let me say that there is a legitimate criticism, which is what might be called cargo cult startups. And so this is a reference to something that the physicist Richard Feynman mentioned actually at a commencement address at Caltech, where he talked about these cargo cults in the South Pacific that during World War II, there were these the planes would come in, the Allied planes would come in with stuff, what the natives called cargo, and after the war ended, there were these sort of religious cults that arose that would make fake like landing strips with people, in their little air towers, and they would go through the motions. They would do the things that used to bring the cargo. But of course, that's not they're just not understanding the cause and effect there. And so there absolutely is. I think when people like with David Heinemeier Hansson and Amy Hoy talk, sort of rail against this culture of taking money, I think they overshoot a little bit sometimes, because there's like I said, there's nothing particularly to be proud of that you didn't bootstrap. Like if you're Google, you shouldn't feel bad that you didn't bootstrap. Or if you're Twitter, you shouldn't feel bad that you didn't bootstrap. And whether you think Twitter is a good company now or not, like clearly the early investors in Twitter are very happy with the results. But like I said, I think they overshoot a little bit, but the criticism is absolutely right. Like the general criticism is right on, which is the idea, I think that what I'm calling cargo cult startups, this idea that a lot of people think that in order to be a successful company, they need to do what other successful companies have done. Like the people who did these cargo cults, they kind of go through the motions. They go to networking events. They have meetings with investors. They raise money, and they think that this is what's going to make them successful. But
they go through Y Combinator.
But no. So so Y Combinator is actually a perfect example of how to bust that cargo cult, because Y Combinator's motto is make something people want. Because what you'll learn if you do Y Combinator, if you read Paul Graham's essays, or if you talk to the Y Combinator partners, they will tell you to ignore all that stuff. Do not go to networking events just for the sake of networking. Don't just go through the motions. What you need to be doing is talking to your customers. What you need to be doing is figuring out how are you going to make something that people actually want. And notice they don't say make something people pay for, right? Because if you make something, it's so hard to make something people want that. Yes, it's better to make something people are willing to pay for, but just making something people want is so hard. Like, let's not make the problem any harder than we have to. So that's the way you solve that dilemma. Is like, how do you not become a cargo cult startup founder? And the answer is you listen to your customers and you try to make something that people actually want and that they will tell their friends about. And the best way to measure your success in that regard is your growth, whether it's the number of people you have signed up, or your revenues if you have a revenue model initially. But whether you take money or not is really a secondary consideration. Your focus should be making something people want, and if it turns out that you're making something that people want so much that you're having trouble keeping up with the growth, and you need to hire people, well, that's music to every investor's ears. Especially if you're a known quantity, if they've like heard of something you've done, but if you can approach an investor and say, here's our growth curve, they don't even need to know really what it is. It's like, is it number of users? Is it whatever? If you can say, we're going vertical here. And if you can just say, we are capital constrained right now, we're growing so fast, we can't keep up. We need to raise some money. Every investor here is like, all right, well, if that's what they do, is they put money in where if it's like, you're growing so fast, you can't keep up. Well, we'll give you some money so you can keep up. That's when you should raise money. If you're not feeling the pain, if you're not growing so fast that you can't keep up, then taking money is probably a mistake, and you should be focusing on making something people want. But it's not wrong to take money under those circumstances, though. And so, like with the stuff I'm working on now, so I've got these learn enough prerequisites, and we're actually working on other learn enough tutorials. I'm working with several people who are making more advanced tutorials that will lead out of the Rails tutorial or other Learn Enough products. And we're also working on turning the whole thing, including the Rails tutorial and all the Learn Enough things, into a subscription service that will have a more structured course. And so going forward in the next year or two, it's possible that we will hit a point where we're growing so fast that I don't want to take money. It's a hassle. I don't like the idea of having investors. You have to keep them in the loop. You have you can't just ignore their emails. It's a weird sort of thing. You can't fire them, but they can't fire you. It's like a weird sort of semi-peer relationship. I would rather avoid it if I can. I would love to bootstrap Learn Enough and maybe have Softcover take off in terms of people using it to make their products, I would love to do that. But if at some point we're growing so fast we can't keep up, then I'm going to start sending emails to people saying, hey, we're growing so fast we can't keep up. You want to write us a check?
Yeah. Well, we can only hope that that gets servicized with AngelList in the next decade or so.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Anyway, well, Michael, thanks for coming on Software Engineering Daily. We've talked for over an hour. It's been awesome conversing with you. Some about Rails, mostly about business, apparently. So, yeah, this was fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on.
It's been a real pleasure. I had a great time. Look forward to seeing how, if people like it. I hope they do. I hope we've made something people want.
Right. Okay, cool. I think they'll love it.